I'll be your wife if you let me sleep here. These 7 words, spoken by a desperate pregnant woman to a hardened mountain man on the most brutal night of winter, would shatter 2 broken lives and forge them into something neither believed possible. What started as a simple plea for shelter became a dangerous game of survival, love, and redemption high in the unforgiving Colorado Rockies. Tonight, I'm taking you into the heart of this incredible true story, one that will test everything you believe about second chances, sacrifice, and the power of human connection. Stay with me until the very end, and please let me know in the comments what city you're watching from so I can see how far this remarkable tale has traveled. Now let me tell you about the night that changed everything. The wind howled like a living thing through the towering pines, carrying with it the promise of death. March in the Colorado Rockies was unforgiving, a month that fooled men into thinking winter had loosened its grip, only to remind them with savage fury that nature answered to no calendar. Matt Collins pulled his wool coat tighter as he stepped onto the covered porch of his cabin, the wooden planks creaking under his boots, despite the thick layer of snow that had accumulated throughout the day. At 34, Matt was a man carved from the very mountains he called home. His hands, scarred from years of chopping wood and working the land, gripped the iron railing as he surveyed the storm that had been building since dawn. The snow fell in sheets so thick he could barely make out the outline of his barn 20 yards away. This wasn't just weather, this was nature's way of reminding every living thing in these mountains exactly who held dominion here. He'd been preparing for this storm for 3 days. The animals were secure, the firewood stacked high, and his pantry stocked with enough supplies to last a month, if necessary. Living alone at 8,000 feet above sea level had taught him that preparation wasn't just wise, it was survival. One mistake, one oversight, and the mountains would claim another victim without ceremony or remorse. Matt had chosen this isolation deliberately. 2 years ago, the world below had become unbearable. The memories, the whispered condolences, the pitying looks, they had driven him higher and higher into the Rockies, until he found this place, a sturdy log cabin built by a prospector in the 1880s, renovated just enough to keep the wind out and the warmth in. Here, surrounded by peaks that touched the sky and valleys that seemed to stretch into eternity, he could finally breathe again. The cabin itself was modest but well built. 2 rooms downstairs, a main living area with a massive stone fireplace, and a small kitchen area and a loft above that served as his bedroom. The thick log walls were chinked with mud and moss, and the roof, though it groaned under heavy snow loads, had never failed him. Oil lamps provided light, a wood-burning stove handled the cooking, and the fireplace kept the whole structure warm even on the coldest nights. It wasn't luxury, but it was sanctuary. Tonight, as the storm raged with increasing intensity, Matt found himself thinking about the letter that had arrived 3 weeks ago. It sat unopened on his kitchen table, the return address written in his sister Catherine's careful script. He knew what it contained, another plea for him to come down from the mountain to rejoin the world, to stop hiding from life, as she put it. Catherine meant well, but she couldn't understand that he wasn't hiding from life. He was hiding from a pain so deep that civilization itself felt like salt in an open wound. The death of his wife Sarah and their infant son Thomas in a carriage accident had broken something inside Matt that couldn't be repaired. The drunk driver who'd caused the crash had walked away without a scratch, while Matt's entire world had been buried in the Denver City Cemetery on a gray October morning. The accident had happened on their way to visit Catherine for Thomas's first birthday celebration. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very act of trying to live, to celebrate, to connect with family had cost him everything that mattered. Up here in the crushing silence of the mountains, he could almost forget. The daily routine of survival left little room for the devastating memories that had once consumed every waking moment. Chopping wood, tending to his horse, Buck and the handful of chickens he kept maintaining the cabin, these simple tasks created a rhythm that kept the darkness at bay. Most days, anyway. As he stood on the porch watching the storm, Matt's thoughts were interrupted by a sound that didn't belong. At first he thought it was just the wind playing tricks, creating phantom noises, the way isolation could make a man's mind conjure voices in empty spaces. But then he heard it again, a rhythmic thumping that cut through the howling wind with desperate urgency. Someone was knocking on his door. Matt's blood ran cold. In 2 years of living on this mountain, he'd had perhaps a dozen visitors, and never in conditions like this. The nearest neighbor, old Henrik Larsson, lived 4 miles down the mountain trail, and he was far too smart to venture out in weather that could kill a man in minutes. The occasional hunter or prospector might stumble across his cabin during better weather, but tonight no one in their right mind would be out there. The knocking came again, weaker this time, and Matt realized with growing alarm that whoever was out there was in serious trouble. He grabbed the rifle from its place beside the door, not out of aggression, but because mountain life had taught him that caution kept you alive. Strange visitors in impossible weather usually meant one of 3 things. Someone was lost and dying, someone was running from something worse than the storm, or someone was bringing trouble to his doorstep. "Hello," he called out, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "Who's there?" The knocking stopped, replaced by a voice so faint he almost missed it. "Please." The word was carried away by the wind, but the desperation in that single syllable was unmistakable. Matt set his rifle aside and unbarred the heavy wooden door, steeling himself for whatever he might find. The door swung open and the storm tried to force its way inside, bringing with it a swirl of snow and a blast of air so cold it seemed to crystallize in his lungs. But it wasn't the weather that made Matt's breath catch. It was the figure huddled on his doorstep. A woman, her dark hair plastered to her head with snow and ice, looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of terror and desperate hope. She was wrapped in a thin cloak that was wholly inadequate for the conditions, and even in the dim light from his oil lamps, Matt could see that she was shivering violently. But what struck him most was her condition. She was heavily pregnant, her belly swollen with child beneath the soaked fabric of her dress. I'm sorry," she managed through chattering teeth. "I didn't know where else to go." Matt stared at her for a moment that felt like an eternity, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. A pregnant woman alone in the middle of a blizzard at his cabin door. It was impossible, and yet she was right there in front of him, snow continuing to accumulate on her shoulders as she swayed with exhaustion. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, stepping forward. "Ma'am, you need to get inside, now." She tried to stand, but her legs buckled and Matt caught her before she could fall. She was frighteningly light despite her pregnancy, and he could feel her entire body trembling as he helped her across the threshold. The moment they were inside, he kicked the door shut against the storm and guided her to the chair closest to the fireplace. "What's your name?" he asked, grabbing a thick wool blanket from his bed and wrapping it around her shoulders. "How did you get here?" She pulled the blanket tighter, her teeth still chattering so violently she could barely speak. "Rebecca," she managed. "Rebecca Dawson." The name meant nothing to Matt, but the way she said it, as if speaking it aloud was dangerous, told him there was more to her story than simple misfortune. He knelt by the fireplace and began building up the fire, adding larger logs to create more heat. "Mrs. Dawson, you're hypothermic. We need to get you warm and dry before we worry about anything else." He stood and moved to his small kitchen area, filling a pot with water and setting it on the wood stove. "I'll make some hot tea, get some food in you." "I don't have money," she said suddenly, her voice small and defeated. "I can't pay you." Matt paused in his preparations and turned to look at her. In the growing firelight, he could see more details, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she held herself as if expecting a blow, the careful way she kept one hand protectively over her belly. This wasn't just a woman caught in a storm, this was a woman running from something. "Mrs. Dawson," he said gently, "I'm not looking for payment, but I need to know, are you hurt? Do you need a doctor?" She shook her head quickly, too quickly. No, doctor, please, I need somewhere safe to stay, just for the night. She looked up at him then, and Matt saw something in her eyes that hit him like a physical blow, the same desperate hope he'd seen in Sarah's eyes the night Thomas was born when complications had threatened both their lives. The storm's not letting up anytime soon, Matt said, stirring honey into the hot tea he'd prepared. Could be days before anyone can travel safely. Rebecca's face crumpled slightly, and for a moment he thought she might cry. Instead, she straightened her shoulders with visible effort and met his gaze directly. When she spoke, her words were barely above a whisper, but they carried the weight of complete desperation. I'll be your wife if you let me sleep here. The cup in Matt's hand nearly slipped from his grasp. He stared at her, certain he'd misheard over the sound of the storm outside. What did you say? I said, I'll be your wife. Her voice was stronger now, though her hands were still shaking. I can cook, clean, mend clothes. I can work. I won't be a burden. I can't go back. Matt set the tea down on the small table beside her chair and took a step back, his mind reeling. In all his years, he'd never heard anything quite so desperate or heartbreaking. This woman, this pregnant woman, was so afraid of something that she was willing to offer herself to a complete stranger in exchange for shelter. Mrs. Dawson, he said carefully, you don't know me. I could be anyone. I could be dangerous. She laughed, but it was a sound devoid of humor. More dangerous than where I came from. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself. I've been walking for 2 days. I saw your light, and it was either your door or dying in the snow. Walking for 2 days in this weather. Matt's concern deepened. Where did you come from? Her expression shuddered immediately. It doesn't matter. What matters is that I can't go back. Matt studied her face in the firelight, noting the way she avoided his eyes when talking about her past. The expensive fabric of her dress, even soaked and travel-stained, spoke of wealth. The careful way she spoke suggested education. This wasn't some frontier woman who'd gotten lost. This was someone from money, someone who'd had every comfort now sitting in his rough mountain cabin offering herself to a stranger. Look, he said, settling into the chair across from her. I'm not looking for a wife, but I'm not going to turn a pregnant woman out into a blizzard either. You can stay until the storm passes and it's safe to travel, no strings attached. Rebecca stared at him for a long moment as if trying to determine whether he was sincere. You won't expect anything from me. The question hit Matt like a punch to the gut. The careful way she asked it, the fear in her voice, it painted a picture he didn't want to contemplate. No, ma'am, I won't expect anything from you, except that you get warm and rest. For the first time since she'd appeared at his door, Rebecca's face showed something other than fear or desperation. Relief flooded her features and her shoulders sagged as tension she'd been carrying finally began to ease. Thank you, she whispered. You don't know what this means. Matt handed her the cup of tea, noting how her hands shook as she wrapped them around the warm ceramic. When's the baby due? 6 weeks, maybe 7. She took a sip of the tea and closed her eyes as the warmth spread through her. I know it's not ideal timing, but I couldn't wait any longer. Couldn't wait for what? Again, that shuddered expression. To leave. Matt wanted to push for more information, but something about the way she held herself like a wild animal ready to bolt at the first sign of threat made him hold back. Whatever had driven her to his door in the middle of a blizzard was serious enough that she'd risked her life and her unborn child's life to escape it. Well, he said finally, let's focus on getting you healthy. Are you hungry? Rebecca nodded, and Matt busied himself preparing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried meat. As he worked, he found himself stealing glances at her, trying to reconcile the refined woman in his chair with the desperate creature who'd appeared at his door. Her hands, though dirty from travel, were soft and uncalloused, the hands of someone who'd never had to work with them. Her posture, even exhausted and frightened, spoke of careful breeding and education. You're not from around here, he said, as he set a plate in front of her. No, She ate slowly, as if each bite was precious. Denver. That explained the expensive dress and refined manner, but it raised new questions. Denver was nearly 60 miles away through some of the most treacherous mountain passes in Colorado. The idea that a pregnant woman had somehow made that journey in winter weather was almost incomprehensible. You came from Denver alone, mostly. She took another bite, chewing slowly. I had a horse for the first day, but she went lame. I had to leave her at a way station. And you walked the rest of the way through the mountains pregnant. Rebecca set down her fork and looked at him directly. Mr. Collins, Matt Collins. Mr. Collins, you seem like a good man, but there are some things that are worse than walking through mountains in a snowstorm. The quiet certainty in her voice told Matt everything he needed to know about why she'd left, even if she wouldn't share the details. He'd seen enough of the world before retreating to his mountain to recognize the signs of abuse, the way she flinched when he moved too quickly, the careful way she positioned herself so she could see both him and the door, the fear that seemed to emanate from her very bones. Your husband, he said quietly. He hurt you. It wasn't a question, and Rebecca didn't treat it as one. She simply nodded her hand, moving unconsciously to her belly. He hurt me, and he would have hurt the baby. I couldn't let that happen. Matt felt a familiar anger rise in his chest. The same rage that had consumed him after Sarah and Thomas died when he'd wanted to hunt down the drunk driver who'd destroyed his family. But this was different. This was happening now to the woman sitting in his cabin, and there was something he could actually do about it. You're safe here, he said firmly. Whatever your husband's name is, whatever power he might have down in Denver, it doesn't reach up here. Charles Dawson. The name escaped her lips like a curse, and his power reaches farther than you might think. Matt felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. He knew that name. Everyone in Colorado knew that name. Charles Dawson was one of the most influential men in the territory, with interests in mining, railroads, and politics. He had enough money to buy his way out of almost any trouble and enough connections to make problems disappear. If Rebecca Dawson was running from Charles Dawson, she wasn't just running from an abusive husband, she was running from one of the most powerful men in Colorado. Jesus, Matt breathed. You're Charles Dawson's wife. Rebecca's face went pale. You know him. I know of him. Everyone does. Matt ran a hand through his hair, suddenly understanding the magnitude of what was happening. Mrs. Dawson, if your husband wants you back, he does. Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact. He'll come looking for me. I know he will. He considers me his property, and Charles doesn't like losing his possessions. Matt felt the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Harboring Charles Dawson's runaway wife wasn't just dangerous, it was potentially fatal. Men like Dawson didn't negotiate or compromise. They took what they wanted, and they destroyed anyone who got in their way. But as he looked at Rebecca, seeing the terror in her eyes and the protective way she cradled her unborn child, Matt realized he'd already made his choice. The moment he'd opened that door and seen her standing in the snow, he'd committed himself to protecting her. Sarah and Thomas were gone, and he couldn't save them. But maybe, just maybe, he could save this woman and her baby. Then we'll deal with that when it happens, he said simply. Rebecca stared at him in amazement. You don't understand. Charles has men resources. He can make you disappear. Maybe. But he'll have to find this place first, and then he'll have to get up here through weather like this. Matt gestured toward the window, where snow continued to pile against the glass. And even if he manages both of those things, he'll still have to deal with me. For the first time since she'd arrived, Rebecca almost smiled. You'd really stand up to Charles Dawson for someone you just met? Matt considered the question seriously. 2 years ago, he might have said no. 2 years ago, he'd been a broken man who'd lost everything and wanted nothing more than to be left alone. But something about this woman, this situation, had awakened something in him that he'd thought was dead forever. "Mrs. Dawson, I've been living up here for 2 years now, and in all that time I haven't had a single thing worth fighting for. Maybe it's time that changed." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin something had shifted. Rebecca was no longer just a desperate woman seeking shelter, and Matt was no longer just a hermit hiding from the world. They were two people who'd found each other in the wilderness, and whether they knew it or not, they'd just committed themselves to a path that would change both their lives forever. As the night deepened and the fire crackled in the hearth, Matt prepared a bed for Rebecca in the main room while he took a blanket up to the loft. Before settling in for the night, he checked and rechecked his rifle, making sure it was clean and loaded. If Charles Dawson came looking for his wife, he'd find more than he bargained for. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, as if the mountains themselves were angry. But inside the small cabin, two broken souls had found something neither had expected: hope. And sometimes in the darkest storms, hope was enough to kindle a fire that could burn bright enough to light the way home. Rebecca lay on the makeshift bed, listening to the storm and thinking about the chain of decisions that had brought her to this moment. 3 days ago, she'd been Mrs. Charles Dawson, living in a mansion in Denver, wearing silk dresses and attending society functions. Tonight, she was a fugitive carrying a child whose father would use him as a weapon if given the chance. The bruises on her ribs ached with each breath, reminders of the beating that had finally given her the courage to run. Charles had been increasingly violent as her pregnancy progressed, as if the very fact of the child growing inside her was a personal affront to his control. When he'd threatened to discipline the brat before it was even born, she'd known she had to leave. But as she drifted off to sleep in the safety of Matt Collins's cabin, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that she'd merely traded one impossible situation for another. Charles would come looking for her, of that she had no doubt. And when he did, this kind mountain man who'd shown her the first real compassion she'd known in years would pay the price for his generosity. The last thing she heard before sleep claimed her was the sound of Matt moving around in the loft above, checking the windows, making sure their sanctuary was secure. For the first time in months, Rebecca felt truly safe. She only hoped it would last long enough for her to figure out what came next. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, and somewhere far below in the civilized world, Charles Dawson was undoubtedly discovering that his wife was missing. The collision between those two realities, the peaceful cabin and the vengeful husband, was inevitable. But for now, in this moment suspended between past and future, Rebecca allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where love could triumph over power, where kindness could defeat cruelty. The mountain would test that hope soon enough. The first rays of dawn filtered through the cabin windows, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. The storm had finally exhausted itself sometime during the night, leaving behind a world transformed by 3 feet of fresh powder and in silence so complete it seemed to ring in Matt's ears. He'd been awake for an hour, lying in his makeshift bed in the loft, listening to Rebecca's steady breathing below and wrestling with the implications of what he'd committed himself to. When he finally climbed down the ladder, he found her still asleep, curled on her side, with one protective hand over her belly. In the soft morning light, the bruises on her face were more visible, a yellowing mark along her jaw, the faint shadow of fingers on her throat. Matt's hands clenched involuntarily as he turned away, busying himself with building up the fire and starting coffee. "Mr. Collins," Rebecca's voice was soft, hesitant. "Morning, Mrs. Dawson." "How did you sleep?" She sat up slowly, wincing slightly as she moved. "Better than I have in months, actually. The quiet is peaceful." Matt poured 2 cups of coffee, handing her one with a careful smile. Mountain mornings have a way of making the world feel possible again. Rebecca accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth. "I should probably tell you more about what you've gotten yourself into." "Only if you want to. But I meant what I said last night. You're safe here, regardless." She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to understand what kind of man would make such a promise to a stranger. "Charles and I have been married for 3 years. It was arranged, more or less. My father had debts, and Charles had ambitions that required a wife from a respected family. Matt settled into the chair across from her, sensing that once she started talking, she needed to get it all out. And your family was respected? The Morgantons of Boston. Old money, old name, but my father had a weakness for cards and bad investments. Rebecca's laugh was bitter. Charles paid off the debts in exchange for my hand in marriage. I was 19 and had no say in the matter. That's a hell of a business transaction to call a marriage. That's exactly what it was. Charles got social standing and a wife who could navigate Denver society, and my family got financial stability. She took a sip of coffee, her eyes distant. For the first year, it wasn't terrible. Charles was often away on business, and I had my own interests, charity work, reading, planning social events. But then she trailed off, her hand moving to her belly again. Matt waited, understanding that some stories couldn't be rushed. Then I got pregnant the first time, she continued quietly. I lost the baby at 4 months, and Charles, he blamed me, said I was too delicate, too weak. After that, everything changed. He became controlling, violent, said he needed to toughen me up so I could give him proper sons. Matt felt that familiar rage building in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. How many times? 3 miscarriages. Each one made him angrier, more brutal. Rebecca's voice was barely above a whisper now. This time, when I realized I was pregnant again, I was terrified, but I made it past 4 months, then 5, then 6. Charles was pleased, but also more possessive than ever. He hired guards to watch me, controlled everything I ate, everything I did, said he wasn't going to let me waste another heir. Jesus Christ. Last week I was in the nursery setting up the cradle that had been delivered. Charles came in and started talking about discipline, about how children needed to learn obedience from birth. He said, she paused, swallowing hard. He said he was going to make sure this child knew who was master from the moment it drew breath. Then he hit me hard enough to knock me down, said it was practice for what he'd do to the baby if it didn't meet his expectations. Matt's coffee cup hit the table harder than he'd intended. That's when you decided to leave. That night, I waited until he was asleep, took what money I could find, and left. I knew he'd come after me, but I couldn't stay. I couldn't let him hurt my baby. The quiet that followed was filled with the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of snow sliding off the roof. Matt stared into his coffee, processing everything she'd told him. Charles Dawson wasn't just an abusive husband, he was a monster, and he had the power and resources to get away with it. Mrs. Dawson, Matt said finally, Rebecca, you did the right thing. Whatever it costs, whatever happens next, you did the right thing. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. Did I? What if he finds us? What if he hurts you because of me? What if? Hey, Matt leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. You can't live your life afraid of what might happen. Trust me, I know something about that. Something in his tone made Rebecca look at him more closely. You've lost someone. It wasn't a question, and Matt found himself nodding before he'd consciously decided to share his story. My wife Sarah and our son Thomas. Carriage accident 2 years ago. Oh, Matt, I'm so sorry. Drunk driver. Sarah and Thomas died instantly, and he walked away without a scratch, spent 6 months in jail, and went right back to drinking. Matt's voice was steady, but Rebecca could hear the pain underneath. That's when I came up here. Couldn't stand being around people anymore, couldn't stand the sympathy and the platitudes and the constant reminders. Is that why you're helping me, because you couldn't save them? Matt considered the question seriously. Maybe partly, but mostly because you showed up at my door asking for help, and turning away a pregnant woman in a blizzard isn't something I could live with. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, 2 people who'd found unexpected understanding and shared loss. Outside, the sun climbed higher, transforming the snow-covered landscape into a wonderland of crystalline beauty. It was hard to believe that anything dangerous could exist in such a peaceful setting. We should probably talk about practical things, Rebecca said eventually. How long can I stay? What happens when the trail's clear? You can stay as long as you need to, but you're right that we need to think ahead. Matt stood and moved to the window, scanning the tree line out of habit. This cabin's remote, but it's not invisible. If Charles sends men looking for you— When he sends men looking for me, Rebecca corrected. He will, Matt. He doesn't give up on anything he considers his. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation, causing Rebecca to freeze and Matt's hand to move instinctively toward his rifle. But the voice that called out was familiar and welcome. Matt, you alive in there, boy? Matt relaxed, recognizing the gravelly voice of Sheriff Jim Mallory. Come on in, Jim. Door's not locked. The door opened to admit a tall, weathered man in his 50s, his badge gleaming against a thick wool coat. Sheriff Mallory had been keeping an eye on Matt since he'd moved to the mountain, partly out of professional duty and partly out of genuine friendship. He stomped the snow off his boots and started to speak, then stopped when he saw Rebecca. Well, I'll be damned. Matt Collins, you've been holding out on me. Jim, this is Mrs. Rebecca Dawson, Rebecca Sheriff Mallory. If the sheriff recognized the Dawson name, he didn't show it immediately. He tipped his hat politely to Rebecca, though Matt could see the lawman's eyes taking in details. Her expensive dress, her obvious pregnancy, the fading bruises on her face. Ma'am, hope you don't mind my asking, but how did you end up on this mountain in the middle of the worst blizzard we've had all winter? Rebecca glanced at Matt, who gave her an encouraging nod. I'm running from my husband, Sheriff. He's been hurting me. Jim's expression darkened immediately. What's your husband's name, ma'am? Charles Dawson. The sheriff went very still. He looked from Rebecca to Matt and back again, his mind clearly working through the implications. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Mrs. Dawson, are you saying that Charles Dawson, the railroad man, has been physically abusing you? Yes, sir, for over 2 years now. It's gotten worse since I became pregnant. Jim removed his hat and ran a hand through his gray hair. Jesus Christ on a crutch. Pardon my language, ma'am, but do you have any idea what you're saying? I know exactly what I'm saying, and I know what it means. Rebecca's voice was steady despite the fear in her eyes. My husband is a powerful man, Sheriff. He has friends in high places, including law enforcement, but I couldn't stay. He was going to hurt my baby. The sheriff looked at Matt with an expression that clearly said, Do you understand what kind of trouble you're in? Matt met his gaze steadily. She needed help, Jim. I wasn't going to turn her away. Matt Charles Dawson owns half the politicians in this territory and has the other half in his pocket. If he wants his wife back, then he can come up here and ask for her himself, Matt said firmly. But she's not going anywhere. She doesn't want to go. Jim studied both of them for a long moment, then sighed heavily. Mrs. Dawson, I need to ask you this directly. Are you willing to swear out a complaint against your husband, officially for the record? Rebecca was quiet for nearly a minute, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. What would happen if I did? Honestly, probably nothing. Charles Dawson has too much influence, and spousal abuse cases are hard to prove under the best circumstances, but it would create a record, something official. And if I don't, then legally you're a runaway wife, and if your husband comes looking for you, I'd be obligated to help him find you. The weight of the sheriff's words settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket. Rebecca was trapped between two impossible choices: stay silent and remain legally defenseless, or speak up and risk everything on a system that probably wouldn't protect her anyway. There's a third option, Matt said quietly. Both Rebecca and Jim turned to look at him. She could stay here, permanently, as my wife. The suggestion hung in the air like a lightning bolt. Rebecca stared at Matt in shock, while Jim's eyebrows shot up to his hairline. Matt, the sheriff said carefully, that would be bigamy. She's already married. Not if she was never legally married to begin with, Matt replied. If the marriage was obtained through coercion, If she was underage or didn't consent freely, it could be challenged. Rebecca found her voice. I was 19 and I did consent. Under duress, but I consented. Then we'd need grounds for annulment or divorce. Matt continued, his mind working through the possibilities. Cruelty, abandonment, fraud, there are options. Jim shook his head slowly. Son, you're talking about taking on one of the most powerful men in Colorado territory in court. He'll destroy you. Maybe, but maybe not. Matt looked at Rebecca, his expression serious but kind. I'm not proposing a real marriage if that's what you're worried about. Just a legal arrangement that would give you protection and give the baby a name and a future. Rebecca's mind reeled. 3 days ago, she'd been a trapped, abused wife with no options. Now, a man she'd known for less than 24 hours was offering to marry her to protect her from her husband. It was insane, impossible, and completely against everything she'd been taught about proper society. Why would you do that? She asked quietly. Matt was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. Because everyone deserves a chance to be happy. Because children shouldn't grow up afraid. And because... He paused, then met her eyes. Because I've been dead for 2 years, and helping you makes me feel alive again. The honesty in his voice was devastating. Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes as she realized that this mountain hermit understood something about her situation that even she hadn't fully grasped. This wasn't just about escaping Charles. It was about reclaiming her right to exist as something other than someone else's property. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course, it's a big decision. Jim cleared his throat. While you're thinking, ma'am, there's something else you should know. I came up here to warn Matt about some strangers who've been asking questions in town. 3 men well-dressed asking about whether anyone had seen a pregnant woman traveling alone. Rebecca's face went white. He's already looking for me. Looks that way. They had a description that matches you pretty well, and they were offering significant money for information. Matt felt ice forming in his veins. How significant? $500 for reliable information leading to your recovery, Mrs. Dawson. That's more than most folks around here make in a year. The implications were clear. With that kind of money on the table, Charles Dawson would have every bounty hunter, drifter, and desperate man in Colorado looking for Rebecca. Her refuge in the mountains had just become considerably more dangerous. When did they start asking around? Matt asked. Yesterday morning, as soon as the storm broke enough for travel. They're being methodical about it, hitting every town, every way station, every ranch between here and Denver. Rebecca stood abruptly, pacing to the window, despite her obvious exhaustion. I should leave. I'm putting you both in danger by being here. Where would you go? Matt asked gently. You're 7 months pregnant. It's the middle of winter. And now there are professional trackers looking for you. I don't know, but I can't stay here. When they find this place... If they find this place, Jim interrupted, they'll have to deal with the fact that you're under the protection of a citizen of this territory. That still means something, even if Charles Dawson doesn't think it does. Matt moved to stand beside Rebecca at the window. We knew this was coming. The question is what we do about it. Rebecca looked at him in surprise. You think I'm going to abandon you now? After everything you've told me? Matt's voice was firm. We're in this together, Rebecca, all the way. The certainty in his voice did something to Rebecca that surprised her. For the first time in years, she felt like she had an ally, someone who would stand beside her instead of controlling her. It was a feeling so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. What do you think they'll do when they get here? She asked. Jim answered before Matt could speak. Depends on their orders. If Charles just wants you back, they'll try to take you peacefully. But if he's angry about you running... He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood that Charles Dawson's men might have instructions that went beyond simple retrieval. Then we need to be ready for them, Matt said simply. Over the next several hours, the 3 of them developed a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than simply waiting for the inevitable. Jim would return to town and keep track of the searchers' progress, feeding Matt information about their movements. Matt would prepare the cabin's defenses and make sure Rebecca had everything she needed to stay safe and comfortable. And Rebecca would rest, regain her strength, and prepare for whatever came next. But as the day progressed and they worked together on practical preparations, something deeper was happening. Rebecca found herself watching Matt as he moved around the cabin, noting the gentle way he spoke to her, the careful attention he paid to her, comfort, the complete absence of the controlling behavior she'd grown to expect from men. There was a quiet strength about him that had nothing to do with dominance and everything to do with genuine care. For his part, Matt found himself drawn to Rebecca's intelligence and resilience. Despite everything she'd been through, she wasn't broken. Frightened, yes. Hurt, certainly. But there was a core of steel in her that Charles Dawson's cruelty hadn't been able to touch. She asked thoughtful questions about the cabin's layout and the surrounding terrain, contributed practical suggestions for their defensive preparations, and showed a courage that amazed him. As evening approached and Jim prepared to head back down the mountain, he pulled Matt aside for a private word. "Son, I've known you for 2 years now, and I've never seen you as focused as you are right now, but I need to make sure you understand what you're getting into." "I understand, Jim." "Do you?" Because Charles Dawson doesn't just have money and influence. He has a reputation for making problems disappear permanently. Men who cross him have a way of ending up dead in alleys or missing entirely. Matt met the sheriff's concerned gaze steadily. "Then I guess I better make sure I'm not an easy problem to solve." Jim sighed. "I'll do what I can to help, but there are limits to what a county sheriff can do against someone with Dawson's resources." "I know, and I appreciate everything you're doing. Just be careful, Matt. That woman has been through enough. She doesn't need to lose someone else who's trying to help her." After Jim left, Matt and Rebecca settled into an evening routine that felt surprisingly natural. She helped prepare dinner despite his protests, moving around the small kitchen with an efficiency that spoke of hard-learned domestic skills. They ate by firelight, conversation flowing easily between them, as if they'd known each other for years rather than days. "Can I ask you something?" Rebecca said as they cleaned up after the meal. "Of course." "Your wife, what was she like?" Matt was quiet for a moment, surprised to find that thinking about Sarah didn't hurt quite as much as it usually did. "She was kind, incredibly kind. She could see the good in anyone, even people who probably didn't deserve it. And she was strong, not physically, but inside. She never let anyone make her feel less than she was." "She sounds wonderful." "She was, and she would have liked you." Rebecca looked up at him in surprise. "How can you be sure?" "Because she always said that the measure of a person wasn't what they had or where they came from, but what they were willing to sacrifice for the people they loved. You walked 60 miles through mountain wilderness to protect your unborn child. Sarah would have respected the hell out of that." That night, as they prepared for bed, Rebecca found herself thinking about Matt's offer of marriage. It was practical, certainly a legal arrangement that would protect her and give her child legitimacy. But there was something more to it, something she was afraid to examine too closely. She'd never had a marriage based on mutual respect and genuine care. Her union with Charles had been a business transaction from the beginning, and it had devolved into a nightmare of control and violence. The idea that marriage could be something different, something kind and supportive, was revolutionary. But was she ready for that? Was it fair to Matt to accept his protection when her feelings were so confused and complicated? And what would happen if Charles found them before any legal arrangements could be made? As she lay on her makeshift bed listening to the settling sounds of the cabin, Rebecca made a decision. Tomorrow she would give Matt her answer. Whatever the risks, whatever the consequences, she couldn't keep running forever. It was time to make a stand, and if she was going to do it, she couldn't think of anyone she'd rather have beside her than the quiet, strong man who'd opened his door to a stranger in a storm. Outside, the mountain slept under its blanket of snow, peaceful and serene. But somewhere below in the civilized world of towns and roads and telegraph lines, Charles Dawson's men were moving steadily closer, following a trail that would inevitably lead them to the small cabin where two souls had found unexpected sanctuary in each other's company. The collision between those two worlds was coming, and when it arrived, it would test everything that Matt and Rebecca were building together. But for now, in the quiet safety of the mountain night, they had found something that neither had expected, hope for a future that neither had dared to imagine. The morning brought with it a clarity that had been absent the day before. Rebecca woke before dawn, her decision crystallized by sleep and the growing certainty that running was no longer an option. She found Matt already awake, sitting by the window with his coffee, watching the tree line with the patient vigilance of a man who understood that danger could arrive at any moment. "I've made up my mind," she said quietly, settling into the chair beside him. Matt turned to look at her, noting the new resolve in her posture. Yes, if the offer still stands, I'll marry you." She paused, then added with a small smile, "Though I have to say it's probably the strangest proposal I'll ever receive." "Probably the strangest one I'll ever make," Matt replied, returning her smile. "But I meant every word of it." They spent the morning discussing practicalities. Jim would need to be involved to handle the legal aspects, and they'd need to move quickly before Charles's men could track Rebecca to the cabin. The marriage would provide some legal protection, but more importantly, it would give Rebecca a new identity and a legitimate claim to remain where she was. "There's something else we need to talk about," Rebecca said, as they prepared a simple lunch. "After the baby comes, what happens then?" Matt had been wondering the same thing. "I suppose we'll figure it out as we go. This arrangement, it doesn't have to be... you'll have your own space, your own life. I'm not expecting anything from you that you're not willing to give." "And what if I want to give more than just a legal arrangement?" The question caught Matt off guard. He studied Rebecca's face, seeing something there that made his heart skip. "Are you saying..." "I'm saying that you're the first man who's ever treated me like a human being instead of a possession. I'm saying that in 3 days you've shown me more genuine kindness than I received in 3 years of marriage to Charles." She took a deep breath. "I'm saying that maybe this could be real if we both want it to be." Matt set down his coffee cup, his hands not entirely steady. "Rebecca, you've been through hell. You might be feeling grateful or dependent, or I might be feeling something genuine for the first time in my adult life." Her voice was firm. "Matt, I'm not a child. I know the difference between gratitude and affection. What I'm feeling for you isn't because you rescued me, it's because of who you are." Before Matt could respond, the sound of horses approaching cut through the morning air. Both of them froze, listening to the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats on packed snow. Matt moved quickly to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. "3 riders," he said quietly, reaching for his rifle. "They're not trying to hide their approach." Rebecca's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "It's them. It has to be." Matt checked his weapon, then moved to the door. "Get behind the kitchen table. If shooting starts, stay down." The riders approached the cabin openly, making no attempt at stealth or surprise. Matt could see them now, 3 men in expensive coats, well-armed and clearly professional. The leader, a tall man with graying hair and cold eyes, dismounted and approached the door, while his companions remained mounted, hands resting casually near their weapons. "Mr. Collins," the man's voice was polite but carried an undertone of authority. "My name is William Hayes. I work for Mr. Charles Dawson. I believe you have something that belongs to him." Matt opened the door but kept his rifle visible. "Mr. Hayes, can't say I have anything that belongs to your boss." Hayes smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Now, Mr. Collins, we both know that's not entirely accurate. Mrs. Dawson is inside your cabin, and Mr. Dawson is very concerned about her welfare. If there's a Mrs. Dawson inside, she's here of her own free will. I'm afraid that's not how the law sees it, sir. A wife belongs with her husband, and Mr. Dawson has every legal right to reclaim his property." The word property hit Matt like a physical blow, confirming everything Rebecca had told him about her husband's attitude. Property. Perhaps I misspoke. His wife, of course. Hayes's tone remained conversational, but his eyes were hard as flint. Mr. Dawson is prepared to be generous about this situation. He understands that you were simply being hospitable to a confused woman. There's no need for this to become unpleasant. And if I don't agree that she's confused, Hayes sighed as if disappointed by Matt's stubbornness, then I'm afraid we'd have to consider you an accomplice to kidnapping. That's a serious crime, Mr. Collins. Could result in considerable jail time, or worse. The threat was delivered with the casual efficiency of a man who'd made many similar threats before. Matt felt his grip tighten on his rifle, but before he could respond, Rebecca stepped into view behind him. "Hello, Mr. Hayes." Her voice was steady, though Matt could hear the fear underneath. "I wondered when Charles would send you." Hayes's demeanor shifted slightly at the sight of her, his professional mask slipping to reveal something uglier underneath. "Mrs. Dawson, your husband has been very worried. You disappeared without a word in your condition. It was very foolish." "My condition is exactly why I left." "Now, ma'am, you know that's not true. Mr. Dawson has provided you with every comfort, every luxury. This cabin..." Hayes gestured dismissively. "This is no place for a woman of your station, especially one carrying his child." Rebecca stepped closer to Matt, her hand finding his arm. "This cabin is the first place I felt safe in years. Mrs. Dawson, I'm going to ask you to gather your things and come with us. Mr. Dawson is waiting, and he's prepared to forgive this episode." "I'm not going anywhere with you." Hayes's mask of politeness finally slipped entirely. "Ma'am, you don't have a choice. You're coming with us, willing or otherwise." That was when Matt stepped forward, placing himself between Hayes and Rebecca. She said no. "Mr. Collins, I strongly advise you not to interfere. Mr. Dawson's patience has limits." "So does mine." Matt's voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute determination. "The lady stays here." Hayes studied Matt for a long moment, clearly recalculating his approach. This mountain hermit wasn't going to be intimidated by threats or legal technicalities. That meant the situation was about to become considerably more complicated. "I see." Hayes stepped back slightly, his hand moving toward his coat. In that case, the sharp crack of a rifle shot split the morning air, and Hayes's hat flew from his head. He spun around to see Sheriff Jim Mallory emerging from the tree line, his own weapon trained on the three men. "That was a warning shot, gentlemen. The next one won't be." Hayes's companions reached for their weapons, but Jim's voice stopped them cold. "I wouldn't. I've got 2 deputies with rifles trained on you from different positions. Move slow and keep your hands visible." "Sheriff Mallory," Hayes's voice was tight with controlled anger, "this is not your jurisdiction." "Actually, it is. This cabin sits in Larimer County, which makes it exactly my jurisdiction." Jim moved closer, his rifle never wavering. "And what I see here looks like attempted kidnapping. This is a domestic matter. Mrs. Dawson belongs with her husband." "Mrs. Dawson is a citizen of this territory with the right to choose where she goes and with whom." Jim's voice carried the authority of his badge. "And she's chosen to stay here." Hayes looked between the Sheriff Matt's rifle and his own precarious position. 3 against 3, but the defenders had better positioning and the element of surprise. More importantly, they had legal authority on their side. "This isn't over," Hayes said finally. "Mr. Dawson won't accept this situation." "Then Mr. Dawson can come up here himself and discuss it like a civilized man," Jim replied. "But if he sends armed men to threaten citizens in my county again, I'll arrest them for disturbing the peace." Hayes signaled his men, and they began backing toward their horses. As they mounted, he turned back to Matt and Rebecca. "Mrs. Dawson, you're making a terrible mistake. Your husband is not a man who gives up easily." "Neither am I," Rebecca replied, her voice stronger than she felt. After the 3 men rode away, Jim approached the cabin, his weapon still ready. That won't be the end of it, he warned. Hayes is Charles Dawson's top enforcer. If he couldn't get Rebecca back with threats, Dawson will escalate. What does that mean? Rebecca asked. It means he'll probably come himself next time with more men and less concern for legal niceties. Matt felt Rebecca shudder beside him. How long do we have? Hard to say. Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on how angry Charles is and how far he's willing to go. Then we need to move fast on the marriage, Matt said. If Rebecca is legally married to me, it might not matter, Jim interrupted. Charles Dawson has enough influence to challenge any marriage he doesn't recognize, but it would give us some legal standing to fight from. They spent the rest of the day making preparations. Jim would arrange for a judge to come up to the cabin within the week to perform the ceremony. In the meantime, Matt would continue fortifying their position, and Rebecca would rest and regain her strength for whatever came next. But that evening, as they sat by the fire discussing their plans, Rebecca was struck by a sudden sharp pain in her abdomen. She gasped, doubling over, and Matt was beside her instantly. What is it? What's wrong? I don't know. It feels like... Oh God, it's happening again. Terror filled her voice as another pain struck. I'm losing the baby. Matt's blood ran cold. Are you sure? Could it be something else? I've been through this before. I know what it feels like. Tears were streaming down Rebecca's face now. Charles was right. I am too weak. I can't even protect my own child. Hey, look at me. Matt knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. You are not weak. You are the strongest woman I've ever met, and we're not giving up on this baby. But if I lose it, what was all of this for? What's the point of fighting Charles if... Another contraction hit stronger this time, and Rebecca cried out. Matt made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week ago. I'm riding to get Doc Harrison. He's the closest thing to a real doctor within 50 miles. Matt, no, it's dangerous. If Charles's men are still out there, then I'll deal with them, but I'm not losing you or this baby. Matt was already moving, gathering his coat and checking his weapons. Bar the door behind me and don't open it for anyone except me or Jim. The ride down the mountain was the longest 2 hours of Matt's life. Every shadow could hide an ambush, every sound could signal danger. But his fear for Rebecca and her unborn child drove him forward, pushing his horse harder than he'd ever pushed an animal before. Doc Harrison was a gruff man in his 60s who'd been delivering babies and patching up wounds on the frontier for more than 30 years. When Matt burst into his office and explained the situation, the doctor didn't hesitate. Sounds like false labor, but we can't take chances. Let me get my bag. The ride back up the mountain was even more harrowing, with Doc Harrison clinging to Matt's horse and both men constantly scanning for threats. But they made it to the cabin without incident, finding Rebecca exactly as Matt had left her, pale but determined. Doc Harrison's examination was thorough and professional. After what felt like hours, he emerged from behind the blanket they'd strung up for privacy with a cautious smile. False alarm mostly. The baby's fine, heartbeat strong. Mrs. Dawson was having some contractions, probably brought on by stress, but she's not in active labor. The relief that flooded through Matt was so intense it left him weak-kneed. She's really okay, both of them. She needs rest, less stress, and better nutrition. But yes, they're both fine. The doctor packed his instruments with practiced efficiency. Though I have to say this is hardly an ideal situation for a woman in her condition. It's the situation we have, Rebecca said from her bed, her voice tired but resolute. Doc Harrison studied her for a moment, then nodded with grudging respect. Well then, we'll make the best of it. I'll leave some medicines with you, and I want to check on you again in a week. After the doctor left, Matt sat beside Rebecca's bed, still shaken by how close they'd come to losing everything. I thought I was going to lose you both, he said quietly. You won't get rid of me that easily. Rebecca managed a weak smile. Besides, this baby is clearly as stubborn as its mother. Good. It'll need to be with everything that's coming. Rebecca reached for his hand. Matt, about what I said earlier before Hayes arrived, about this being real between us. Do you think less of me for saying it? Matt considered the question seriously. I think you're braver than anyone has a right to be. I think you've been through more than most people could survive, and you're still fighting. And I think... He paused, then met her eyes. I think I'm falling in love with you. And that scares me more than Charles Dawson ever could. Why does it scare you? Because I already lost one family. I don't think I could survive losing another. Rebecca squeezed his hand. Then we'll have to make sure that doesn't happen. The next few days passed in relative peace, but it was the kind of peace that comes before a storm. Matt continued his preparations, checking and rechecking their defenses, while Rebecca focused on regaining her strength. They talked constantly, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes for the future, and their growing feelings for each other. Jim visited twice, bringing news from town and reassurance that the legal arrangements were proceeding. The judge would arrive at the end of the week, and they'd managed to keep word of the impending marriage quiet. But Jim also brought troubling news. Charles Dawson had arrived in the area personally, along with a dozen hired guns. He's not trying to hide it, Jim reported. Took over the entire hotel in Millbrook, posted men around town. Folks are scared. What's his play? Matt asked. Hard to say. Could be waiting for the right moment to strike, or he could be trying to pressure you through fear. Either way, he's making his presence known. That night, as if summoned by their conversation about him, Charles Dawson himself appeared at their door. Unlike Hayes's earlier visit, this one came without the pretense of civility or legal authority. Dawson arrived alone, though Matt had no doubt armed men were positioned nearby. Matt opened the door to find himself face to face with one of the most powerful men in Colorado territory. Charles Dawson was everything Rebecca had described: tall, imposing, with the kind of presence that commanded attention and obedience. But his eyes were what struck Matt most. They were the eyes of a man who'd never been told no, never been denied anything he wanted. Mr. Collins, I'm Charles Dawson. I know who you are. Then you know why I'm here. Dawson's voice was calm, controlled, but Matt could hear the rage simmering underneath. I want my wife back. She's not your wife anymore. She's going to be mine. Dawson's composure cracked slightly. That's legally impossible. She's already married to me. Marriages obtained through coercion can be annulled. I'm sure a man of your education knows that. Coercion. My dear Mr. Collins, you've clearly been listening to the ravings of an unstable woman. Rebecca has always been imaginative. Matt stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him. He wouldn't let Dawson speak about Rebecca that way in her presence. The bruises on her face weren't imaginary. Accidents happen. Rebecca can be quite clumsy, especially in her condition. The casual dismissal of what had clearly been systematic abuse made Matt's hands clench into fists. Get off my property. Dawson studied Matt with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up prey. You're making a serious mistake, Mr. Collins. I am not a man accustomed to being denied what belongs to me. She's not a possession. She's a human being with the right to choose her own life. How refreshingly naive. Let me explain something to you about the real world. Dawson stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. I own this territory. The judges, the politicians, the law enforcement, they all answer to me. If I want you arrested, you'll be arrested. If I want you to disappear, you'll disappear. And if I want my wife back, I'll have her back. Then why haven't you taken her? The question seemed to surprise Dawson. Excuse me, if you own everything and everyone, why are you here talking to me? Why didn't you just take her and be done with it? For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Dawson's features. I'm trying to resolve this civilized manner. No, you're not. You're here because you can't just take her, because Jim Mallory won't be bought or intimidated, because there are still people in this territory who believe in doing what's right instead of what's profitable. Matt stepped closer to Dawson, his own voice dropping to match the other man's whisper. And because deep down you know that what you did to her was wrong, and you're afraid of what will happen when the whole world knows what kind of man you really are. The mask of civility finally fell away completely, revealing the monster underneath. Dawson's face contorted with rage and his hand moved toward his coat. You sanctimonious mountain trash! You have no idea who you're dealing with. Neither do you. The quiet voice came from behind Matt. Both men turned to see Rebecca standing in the doorway, her face pale but her posture erect and defiant. Hello, Charles. Dawson's expression shifted, becoming something that might have been mistaken for affection, if not for the possessive hunger in his eyes. Rebecca, you look well. I am well. For the first time in years, I'm well. This foolishness has gone on long enough. You're coming home with me. I am home. The simple statement hit Dawson like a physical blow. You can't possibly mean that. This hovel, this peasant, they're nothing compared to what I can give you. You never gave me anything except fear and pain. Rebecca stepped fully onto the porch, moving to stand beside Matt. You gave me a beautiful house that felt like a prison, expensive clothes that felt like chains, and jewelry that felt like shackles. But you never gave me what I needed most. And what was that? Dawson's voice was tight with barely controlled fury. Respect, kindness, love. Rebecca took Matt's hand, her fingers intertwining with his. This man has given me all of those things in 5 days, while you couldn't manage any of them in 3 years. Dawson stared at their joined hands with an expression of pure hatred. When he spoke, his voice was barely human. You're carrying my child, my heir. That gives me rights that no mountain hermit can take away. Your heir, Rebecca's voice rose with her own anger. You beat me while I was pregnant. You threatened to hurt the baby before it was even born. You forfeited any rights to this child the moment you raised your hand to me. That child is mine by law and by blood. No. The voice that answered wasn't Rebecca's or Matt's, but Sheriff Jim Mallory's. The lawman emerged from the shadows beside the cabin, his badge gleaming in the moonlight. That child belongs to whoever raises it with love and care. And from what I've seen, that's going to be Matt and Rebecca Collins. Dawson spun to face the sheriff. His composure finally shattered completely. This is none of your business, Sheriff. It became my business when you brought armed men into my county to threaten my citizens. Jim's voice was steady, professional. It became my business when you posted guards around Millbrook like you owned the place. And it became my business when you decided to settle a domestic dispute with intimidation and violence. You can't stop me from taking what's mine. Watch me. The standoff stretched taut between the four of them, with decades of civilization and law balanced against raw power and unlimited resources. For a moment it seemed that violence was inevitable, that the careful balance of their mountain sanctuary would be shattered by gunfire and bloodshed. Then Dawson stepped back, his face settling into an expression of cold calculation that was somehow more terrifying than his earlier rage. This isn't over, not by a long shot. He looked directly at Rebecca. You think you can hide from me forever. You think this pathetic charade will protect you. I think I'm tired of being afraid of you, Rebecca replied. I think I'm done letting you control my life. Dawson nodded slowly, as if filing away her words for future use. We'll see how long that lasts. He turned and walked back toward the tree line, disappearing into the darkness as suddenly as he'd appeared. But his presence lingered like a toxic cloud, poisoning the peace they'd built over the past week. He'll be back, Jim said quietly. I know, Matt replied, his arm going around Rebecca's shoulders. But we'll be ready. As they returned to the cabin, Rebecca felt the baby kick strongly inside her, as if the child, too, was ready to fight for the life they were building together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new tests of their resolve. But tonight, in the warmth and safety of their mountain home, She allowed herself to believe that love might truly be stronger than power, that courage might triumph over cruelty. The final confrontation was coming, and they all knew it. But for the first time since she'd fled Denver, Rebecca wasn't facing it alone. The silence that followed Charles Dawson's departure was heavy with unspoken threats and promises of violence to come. Matt stood on the porch long after the sound of horses had faded into the night, his rifle ready, and his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Rebecca had gone inside at Jim's insistence, but he could see her silhouette in the window, equally vigilant despite her exhaustion. "He won't wait long," Jim said quietly, joining Matt at the porch railing. "Charles Dawson's not a patient man under the best of circumstances, and this situation has wounded his pride in ways that money can't heal." "How much time do you think we have?" "Hard to say. Could be hours, could be days. But he'll come back with everything he's got." Jim adjusted his badge, a gesture Matt had come to recognize as a sign of the sheriff's deepest concerns. "I've sent word to the territorial marshal, but even if he responds immediately, it'll be weeks before any help arrives." Matt nodded, understanding the implications. Whatever happened next would be decided by the people already on this mountain with the resources they had at hand. "The judge still coming tomorrow. Judge Morrison will be here at noon. He's a good man, honest, but even he'll be taking a risk performing this ceremony. Dawson's reach extends into the territorial court system. Will the marriage hold up legally?" Jim was quiet for a moment, considering. "If Morrison performs it and we get it properly recorded, it should. But Charles will challenge it every way he can. The question is whether we can survive long enough for the legal system to work." Inside the cabin, Rebecca moved carefully around the small space, her hand resting protectively on her belly as she felt the baby's increasingly active movements. The confrontation with Charles had shaken her more than she'd let on, not because of his threats, she'd lived with those for years, but because seeing him again had reminded her just how much power he wielded and how far he was willing to go to maintain control. "Rebecca," Matt entered quietly, noting the tension in her posture. "How are you holding up? I keep thinking about what he said, about this being a pathetic charade." She turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "What if he's right? What if I'm just trading one form of captivity for another?" Matt moved to her side, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Is that what this feels like to you, captivity?" "No, God, no. It feels like—" She searched for the right words. "It feels like the first time in my adult life that I get to choose something for myself. But Charles has a way of twisting everything, of making you doubt your own perceptions. He's a master manipulator. That's how men like him maintain power." Matt's voice carried the weight of hard-won understanding. "But you're not the same woman who fled his house a week ago. You're stronger now, more certain of who you are and what you want." Rebecca looked up at him, seeing the quiet strength that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "And what I want is this life, this chance, this future we're building together." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Multiple riders, this time moving with military precision. Matt grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, Rebecca close behind him, despite his gesture for her to stay back. "At least 8 men, he reported grimly. "They're surrounding the cabin." Jim appeared at the back door, having circled around from his position outside. "They've got us completely encircled. Professional job, these aren't local hired guns." A voice called out from the darkness, cultured and confident. "Mr. Collins, I believe you know why we're here. Send Mrs. Dawson out and no one needs to get hurt." Matt recognized the voice as belonging to Hayes Dawson's chief enforcer. "She's not going anywhere with you. I'm afraid that's not your decision to make. Mrs. Dawson belongs with her husband, and we're prepared to use whatever force is necessary to ensure her safe return." "Safe return?" Rebecca called out, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "Since when has Charles Dawson been concerned with my safety? Mrs. Dawson, your husband is worried sick about you. He's prepared to forgive this entire episode if you come home willingly. I am home. Hayes's laugh was cold and humorless. Ma'am, you're living in a one-room cabin with a mountain hermit 8 months pregnant in the middle of nowhere. That's not a home, that's a delusion. Matt felt Rebecca stiffen beside him, and he recognized the calculated cruelty of Hayes's words. The man was trying to undermine her confidence, to make her doubt the choices she'd made. This cabin has more love and warmth in it than the Dawson mansion ever did, she replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. And this mountain hermit has shown me more respect and kindness than my husband managed in 3 years of marriage. Pretty words, ma'am, but they won't keep you warm when winter comes again. They won't put food on your table or clothes on your child's back. They won't put bruises on my face either, Rebecca shot back, or make me fear for my unborn baby's safety. The silence that followed was pregnant with tension. Hayes had overplayed his hand, and everyone knew it. By focusing on material concerns, he'd inadvertently highlighted the real reason Rebecca had fled, not poverty or hardship, but fear for her life and her child's welfare. Mr. Collins, Hayes called out again, his tone more businesslike now. You're harboring another man's wife. That makes you guilty of kidnapping under territorial law. Surrender Mrs. Dawson now, and Mr. Dawson might be willing to overlook your involvement in this affair. And if I don't, then you'll be arrested for kidnapping, and if you resist arrest— Hayes left the threat unfinished, but its meaning was clear. Jim stepped forward, his badge glinting in the lamplight from the cabin window. This is Sheriff Mallory. You men are trespassing on private property and threatening law-abiding citizens. I order you to disperse immediately. Sheriff, this is a family matter. We're simply here to retrieve Mr. Dawson's wife. The lady has stated clearly that she doesn't wish to go with you. That makes this attempted kidnapping not a family matter. With all due respect, Sheriff, your authority doesn't extend to overruling a husband's legal rights. My authority extends to protecting citizens of this territory from unlawful detention and threats of violence, Jim replied firmly. And that's exactly what I intend to do. Matt could see the situation deteriorating rapidly. Hayes and his men clearly had orders to retrieve Rebecca at any cost, while Jim was equally determined to protect her rights as a citizen. The standoff was about to turn violent, and when it did, Rebecca would be caught in the crossfire. There's another way to resolve this, Matt called out suddenly. I'm listening, Hayes replied. Single combat. Me against your best man. Winner takes all. Rebecca grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with alarm. Matt, no. These men are professionals. They'll kill you. Maybe, but it's better than a shootout with you in the middle of it. Hayes seemed to consider the proposal. What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Collins? Your best fighter against me. Hand-to-hand combat, no weapons. If I win, you and your men leave and don't come back. If your man wins, Mrs. Dawson goes with you willingly. Matt, I will not agree to that, Rebecca said fiercely. I won't be used as stakes in some barbaric contest. It's not barbaric if it prevents bloodshed, Matt replied gently. And you wouldn't be stakes, you'd be the prize I'm fighting to protect. The offer is interesting, Hayes called out, but I'm afraid Mr. Dawson's instructions were quite specific. Mrs. Dawson returns with us tonight one way or another. Then it looks like we have ourselves a Mexican standoff, Jim observed grimly. For several long minutes, the two sides faced each other across the clearing, each waiting for the other to make the first move. The tension was so thick it seemed to crackle in the cold mountain air, and Matt found himself thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought them all to this moment. A week ago, he'd been a solitary hermit, content to live out his days in isolation. Now he was preparing to fight for a woman he loved and a child that wasn't biologically his against some of the most dangerous men in Colorado territory. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to save Rebecca, he'd found something worth living for again. Mr. Hayes, the voice came from the trees behind the cabin, causing everyone to tense and look for the source. This is Judge Morrison. I'm ordering you and your men to stand down immediately." Matt's heart leaped with hope. The judge had arrived early, and his presence changed everything. As an officer of the territorial court, Morrison had the authority to resolve the situation legally rather than through violence. Hayes's voice carried a note of uncertainty for the first time. "But Judge Morrison, this is a private matter. We're simply retrieving a runaway wife." "There's nothing private about 8 armed men surrounding a cabin and threatening its occupants," Morrison replied sharply. The judge emerged from the trees, a small but imposing figure, despite his advanced age. "I've been watching this situation develop for the past hour, and what I see is a clear case of attempted kidnapping. Your Honor, with all due respect, a man has a right to reclaim his wife. A man has no right to use armed force against citizens of this territory, regardless of his marital status." Morrison approached the cabin, his presence somehow making the armed men seem less threatening. "Mrs. Dawson, are you in that cabin of your own free will?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And do you wish to return to your husband?" "No, Your Honor, I do not." "Mr. Hayes, you have your answer. The lady has stated her position clearly, and the law protects her right to make that choice." Hayes was clearly struggling with his orders versus the legal reality he now faced. "Judge Morrison, Mr. Dawson has legal rights as a husband. Mr. Dawson's rights as a husband do not include the use of armed force or the violation of territorial law." Morrison interrupted. "You and your men will withdraw immediately, or I'll have Sheriff Mallory arrest the lot of you for conspiracy to commit kidnapping." The standoff stretched for another tense moment before Hayes finally signaled his men to mount up. "This isn't over, Judge. Mr. Dawson has resources and influence that extend well beyond this mountain. Mr. Dawson's resources don't extend to overruling territorial law or threatening federal judges," Morrison replied calmly. "Good evening, Mr. Hayes." As the sound of departing horses faded into the night, Matt felt his legs go weak with relief. Rebecca sagged against him, her own strength finally giving out. After hours of sustained terror, Jim holstered his weapon and moved to secure the perimeter while Judge Morrison approached the cabin. "Judge Morrison," Matt said gratefully, "your timing couldn't have been better. I suspected something like this might happen when Sheriff Mallory told me about the situation." Morrison was a small man with keen eyes and a bearing that commanded respect despite his physical stature. Charles Dawson's reputation for getting his way through intimidation is well known in territorial legal circles. "Will they be back?" Rebecca asked. "Almost certainly, but perhaps not tonight, and hopefully not with the same level of force." Morrison studied her with professional interest. "Mrs. Dawson, I understand you wish to dissolve your marriage to Charles Dawson and enter into a new union with Mr. Collins." "Yes, Your Honor. The legal situation is complex but not impossible. Your current marriage was contracted in Denver under territorial law, which gives me jurisdiction to review it for validity." Morrison removed a leather portfolio from his coat. "However, I should warn you that Charles Dawson will challenge any ruling I make, and he has the resources to tie this up in the courts for years." "What would you need to annul the marriage?" Matt asked. "Evidence of coercion, fraud, or systematic abuse. Given what I've observed tonight and what Sheriff Mallory has told me, I believe we have grounds for annulment based on systematic abuse and coercion." Rebecca's heart began to race. The possibility of being legally free from Charles seemed too good to be true. What kind of evidence? Medical records documenting injuries, witness testimony, documentation of threats or violent behavior. Morrison's expression was grave. "Mrs. Dawson, annulling your marriage will require you to testify publicly about what your husband did to you. That testimony will become part of the public record, and Charles Dawson will use every legal weapon at his disposal to discredit you." "I understand, and I'm prepared to do whatever it takes." "Very well, I can perform the annulment ceremony and the new marriage tomorrow. but I want both of you to understand the risks you're taking. Charles Dawson is not a man who accepts defeat gracefully. That night, as they prepared for what might be their wedding day, Matt and Rebecca talked quietly about the future they hoped to build together. The immediate danger had passed, but they both understood that larger challenges lay ahead. "Are you having second thoughts?" Matt asked as they settled in for the night. "About marrying you? Never." Rebecca's voice was firm. "About the fight we're about to face every minute. We don't have to do this. You could come with me to California, start over somewhere. Charles can't find us." Rebecca considered the suggestion seriously. Running for the rest of our lives, always looking over our shoulders, always wondering when he'll catch up. She shook her head. "I'm tired of running, Matt. I want to make a stand, even if it means putting you and the baby at risk. Especially then, I want this child to grow up knowing that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when the odds are against you." The next morning dawned clear and cold, with a crispness in the air that spoke of changing seasons. Judge Morrison arrived early, accompanied by Jim and 2 other men who would serve as witnesses to the proceedings. The judge had spent the night in town but had risen before dawn to make the journey to the cabin. "Before we proceed," Morrison said, setting his papers on the small table that would serve as his bench, "I want to make sure you both understand what we're doing here. Mrs. Dawson, by proceeding with this annulment, you're officially declaring that your marriage to Charles Dawson was invalid from the beginning. This will free you to marry Mr. Collins, but it will also make you vulnerable to Charles's retaliation." "I understand, Your Honor. And Mr. Collins, by marrying Mrs. Dawson under these circumstances, you're taking on not just a wife, but also her legal battles, her unborn child, and the enmity of one of the most powerful men in Colorado territory. Are you prepared for that?" Matt looked at Rebecca, seeing the hope and fear warring in her eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried absolute conviction. "Your Honor, I've never been more certain of anything in my life." The annulment ceremony was brief but thorough. Morrison questioned Rebecca extensively about her marriage to Charles, documenting the pattern of abuse and coercion that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Her testimony was difficult to hear, but it established clearly that her consent to the marriage had been obtained through financial pressure and that the marriage itself had been characterized by systematic violence. Based on the testimony presented, Morrison declared, "I find that the marriage between Rebecca Morganton and Charles Dawson was obtained through coercion and characterized by systematic abuse. Therefore, I hereby declare said marriage null and void, as if it had never existed." Rebecca felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she'd been carrying for so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to be free. For the first time in 3 years, she was legally her own person, beholden to no one but herself. The wedding ceremony that followed was simple but deeply moving. With Jim and the other witnesses present, Matt and Rebecca exchanged vows that spoke not just of love, but of partnership, mutual respect, and shared commitment to building a life based on equality rather than dominance. "Do you, Matthew Collins, take Rebecca to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love, honor, and cherish in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do." "And do you, Rebecca, take Matthew to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love, honor, and cherish in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" Rebecca's voice was clear and strong. "I do. By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Collins, you may kiss your bride." The kiss they shared was gentle, filled with promise and hope for the future they would build together. When they broke apart, Rebecca felt tears on her cheeks, tears of joy rather than fear for the first time in years. But their celebration was short-lived. Even as Judge Morrison was packing his papers and preparing to depart, the sound of approaching horses reached their ears. This time there was no attempt at stealth or negotiation. Charles Dawson himself led the charge with at least 20 armed men behind him. It seems Mr. Dawson has decided to escalate the situation, Morrison observed grimly. Matt moved to the window, his heart sinking as he counted the riders. There's too many of them. We can't fight that many men. We don't have to fight them, Jim said, checking his weapon. We just have to hold them off long enough for the territorial marshal to arrive. How long is that going to be? Matt asked. Could be days, could be weeks. Outside, Charles Dawson's voice carried across the clearing, filled with rage and wounded pride. Collins, I know you're in there. You've made the biggest mistake of your miserable life. Matt opened the door, but stayed behind cover. Dawson, you're trespassing on private property. My wife is in that cabin. I want her back, and I want her back now. She's not your wife anymore, Judge Morrison called out, stepping into view, despite Jim's gesture for him to stay back. I've just performed an annulment ceremony. The marriage between Rebecca Morganton and Charles Dawson is legally null and void. The silence that followed was more ominous than any threat. When Charles finally spoke, his voice was barely controlled fury. Judge Morrison, I should have known you'd be involved in this farce. There's nothing farcical about territorial law, Mr. Dawson. Mrs. Collins is now legally married to Mr. Collins, and your claim to her is terminated. Mrs. Collins? Charles's laugh was ugly, filled with promise of violence. We'll see about that. What happened next would be burned into Matt's memory forever. Charles raised his hand, and his men began to spread out clearly, preparing for an assault on the cabin. Jim moved to a defensive position, his rifle ready, while Morrison tried to position himself where his judicial authority might provide some protection. But before the first shot could be fired, a new sound reached their ears, the thunder of many horses approaching fast from down the mountain. Charles and his men turned toward the sound, uncertainty flickering across their faces for the first time. United States Marshal! The voice that boomed across the clearing carried federal authority. Everyone lay down your weapons immediately. Marshal William Crawford emerged from the tree line with a full posse of federal deputies, their badges gleaming and their weapons ready. The marshal was a legend in Colorado territory, a man who'd built his reputation on enforcing federal law regardless of local politics or influence. Marshal Crawford, Charles called out, his voice carefully controlled. This is a private matter. I'm simply retrieving my runaway wife. Mr. Dawson, what I see is 20 armed men threatening federal officers and territorial citizens. That's a violation of federal law regardless of your marital status. The woman in that cabin belongs to me. The woman in that cabin is Mrs. Rebecca Collins, legally married to Mr. Matthew Collins under territorial law. Judge Morrison has just informed me of the proceedings via telegraph. Crawford's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. You and your men will disperse immediately, or you'll be arrested for conspiracy to commit kidnapping and violation of federal statutes. Charles looked around at his men, calculating odds and options. Against the local sheriff and a handful of mountain folk, he'd held all the advantages. Against a federal marshal with a full posse, the equation had changed dramatically. This isn't over, Crawford. I have rights under territorial law. Your rights under territorial law don't extend to armed insurrection against federal authority, Crawford interrupted. You have 5 minutes to clear this area, Mr. Dawson. After that, anyone still here will be considered in violation of federal law and subject to arrest. The standoff that followed seemed to last forever, but Charles finally signaled his men to withdraw. As they mounted their horses, he looked directly at the cabin where Matt and Rebecca waited. Enjoy your victory while it lasts, Collins. Money and influence have long memories, and I'm a very patient man. But even as he rode away, Rebecca could see the defeat in his posture. The legal marriage to Matt, witnessed by federal authorities and performed by a territorial judge, had effectively ended Charles's claim to her. He might continue to fight through the courts, but his power to simply take what he wanted had been broken. As the sound of departing horses faded, Rebecca Collins, she was Rebecca Collins now, she realized with wonder, stepped out onto the porch of her home and breathed deeply of the mountain air. For the first time in her adult life, she was truly free, free to choose her own path, free to love whom she pleased, free to raise her child without fear. Matt joined her on the porch, slipping his arm around her waist as they watched the sun climb higher over the peaks that surrounded their valley. Below them, the marshals were setting up a temporary camp, ensuring that Charles Dawson's retreat was permanent. Judge Morrison was preparing to return to town, his work completed. Sheriff Jim was checking the perimeter one final time, making sure their sanctuary remained secure. "Mrs. Collins," Matt said softly, testing the sound of her new name. "Mr. Collins," she replied, smiling up at him. They stood together in the morning sunlight, two people who'd found love in the most unlikely circumstances, surrounded by the vast beauty of the Colorado Rockies. The future stretched before them, full of possibilities and challenges they would face together. Inside Rebecca's womb, their child, for the baby, was theirs now, regardless of biology, stirred as if sensing the change in his mother's circumstances. Soon he would be born into a world where love triumphed over power, where courage conquered fear, and where two broken souls had found healing in each other's arms. The mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the promise of seasons to come, of challenges and joys still ahead. But for now, in this perfect moment, Rebecca and Matt Collins stood together on their porch, legally married, federally protected, and genuinely in love. Charles Dawson's shadow would always linger at the edges of their lives, but it could no longer control them. They had built something stronger than his wealth, more enduring than his influence, more powerful than his threats. They had built a family based on love, and that was something that could never be taken away. The days following their wedding passed in a strange mixture of peace and vigilance. Marshal Crawford and his deputies maintained their camp in the valley, below a visible deterrent to any thoughts Charles might have of returning with force. But even with federal protection, Matt and Rebecca understood that their real challenges were just beginning. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Rebecca went into labor during the early hours of a September morning. The contractions began gently, almost apologetically, as if the baby understood the delicate nature of the world he was about to enter. Matt had been awake most of the night, restless with the intuition that comes to expectant fathers, and he was beside Rebecca's bed within moments of her first sharp intake of breath. "Is it time?" he asked quietly, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "I think so." Rebecca's voice was steady, but Matt could hear the mixture of excitement and fear underneath. "The pains are getting stronger and closer together." Matt had prepared for this moment as thoroughly as he'd prepared for Charles's attacks. Doc Harrison was staying in the valley with the marshal's men, ready to be summoned at a moment's notice. Clean water was boiling on the stove, fresh linens were stacked beside the bed, and everything they might need was within arm's reach. "I'll get the doctor," Matt said, starting to rise. Rebecca gripped his hand tightly. "Not yet. Stay with me for a while." They sat together in the pre-dawn darkness, talking quietly, between contractions, about the life they were about to bring into the world. Rebecca had spent months worrying about whether the baby would be affected by the stress and violence of her pregnancy, but Doc Harrison had assured them that the child's heartbeat remained strong and regular. "What if I'm not a good mother?" Rebecca asked during a lull in the pains. "What if I don't know how to love a child properly?" "You already love this baby more than life itself," Matt replied gently. "I see it in the way you talk to him, the way you protect him, the way you sing to him when you think I'm not listening." But what if Charles was right? What if I am too weak, too broken? "Hey." Matt's voice was firm but loving. "Charles Dawson doesn't get to define who you are anymore. You're the strongest woman I've ever known, and you're going to be an incredible mother." As the sun rose over the mountains, the contractions intensified, and Matt finally rode down to fetch Doc Harrison. The old physician took one look at Rebecca and nodded approvingly. "Strong and steady labor," he pronounced after his examination. "This baby knows what he's doing, should be born sometime this afternoon." The hours that followed tested everyone's endurance. Rebecca labored with a quiet determination that amazed both men, never complaining despite the obvious pain. Matt stayed beside her throughout, offering water, cool cloths, and constant encouragement. Doc Harrison monitored the baby's progress with professional calm, but Matt could see the satisfaction in his eyes as everything proceeded normally. "I can see the head," the doctor announced finally. "One more good push should do it, Rebecca." Rebecca gathered her strength for the final effort, and with a cry that seemed to echo off the mountain peaks themselves, she brought her son into the world. The baby's first wail was strong and indignant, as if protesting his eviction from the warm comfort of the womb. "It's a boy," Doc Harrison announced unnecessarily, holding up the red squirming infant. "And he's perfect." Matt felt tears streaming down his cheeks as he looked at the tiny person who would be his son in every way that mattered. The baby had Rebecca's delicate features, but a head of dark hair that reminded Matt of his own childhood photographs. "Samuel," Rebecca said softly, reaching for her child. "His name is Samuel." "Samuel Collins," Matt added, and the sound of it felt absolutely right. Doc Harrison cleaned the baby and wrapped him in soft blankets before placing him in Rebecca's arms. The transformation that came over her face was extraordinary. The exhaustion and pain faded, replaced by a radiance that seemed to illuminate the entire cabin. "Hello, Samuel," she whispered to the baby, who had stopped crying and was staring up at her with dark, serious eyes. "I'm your mother, and this is your father, and we love you more than you'll ever know." Matt leaned over to study his son more closely, marveling at the tiny fingers and perfect features. When Samuel's small hand closed around Matt's finger with surprising strength, the last of the walls around his heart finally crumbled completely. "He's beautiful, Rebecca, absolutely beautiful." "He looks like you," she said, though Matt could see Charles's influence in the baby's bone structure. It didn't matter. This child would be shaped by love and care, not by the circumstances of his conception. Doc Harrison finished his work and packed his instruments with quiet efficiency. Mother and baby are both healthy. Rebecca needs rest and the baby needs to eat, but they've both come through beautifully. After the doctor left, Matt and Rebecca spent their first hours as parents in quiet wonder. Samuel nursed hungrily, then fell asleep in his mother's arms with the complete trust that only newborns possess. The afternoon light streaming through the cabin windows seemed to bless the small family, creating a golden cocoon of peace around them. "I can't believe he's really here," Rebecca murmured, stroking the baby's soft hair. "After everything we went through to protect him, he's finally safe." "We're all safe now," Matt replied, though he knew that safety was a relative concept when Charles Dawson remained in the world. Their peaceful domesticity was interrupted that evening by Marshal Crawford's arrival at the cabin door. The federal lawman had news that would change their understanding of their situation entirely. "Mrs. Collins, Mr. Collins," Crawford said, accepting their invitation to enter. "I wanted to inform you personally about some developments regarding Charles Dawson." Matt felt Rebecca tense beside him, her arms instinctively tightening around the sleeping baby. "What kind of developments?" "Mr. Dawson has been arrested by federal authorities in Denver on charges of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. It seems his business practices finally caught up with him." The news hit them like a thunderbolt. Rebecca stared at the marshal in disbelief. "Arrested Charles has been arrested." "Yes, ma'am. A federal investigation that's been ongoing for months finally gathered enough evidence to move. Railroad contracts, mining claims, political bribes. The list is extensive." Matt felt a mixture of relief and wariness. What does this mean for us? It means Mr. Dawson will be facing federal charges that could result in significant prison time. Even if he's eventually acquitted, his political and economic influence has been severely damaged. Crawford paused, then continued more gently. It also means that his ability to pursue this personal matter has been greatly reduced. Rebecca looked down at Samuel, who was beginning to stir in her arms. So we're really free. He can't hurt us anymore. I can't promise that completely, ma'am. Mr. Dawson still has resources and connections, but his attention will be focused on his legal troubles for the foreseeable future, and his power to act against you has been significantly curtailed. After the marshal left, Matt and Rebecca sat in stunned silence, trying to process this unexpected turn of events. The threat that had loomed over them for weeks had suddenly diminished, not through their own actions, but through the workings of justice on a larger scale. I keep waiting for it to be a trick, Rebecca said finally. Some elaborate scheme to make us lower our guard. It's not a trick. Charles Dawson finally pushed too far, stepped on the wrong people, and got caught. Matt moved to stoke the fire, his mind already turning to practical considerations. The question is, what do we do now? They spent the following weeks adjusting to their new reality as parents, while slowly accepting that the immediate danger from Charles had passed. Samuel proved to be a remarkably easy baby, sleeping well and eating heartily, as if determined to make up for the stress he'd caused during his gestation. Rebecca recovered quickly from the birth, her strength and vitality returning with each passing day. But as autumn deepened into winter, they began to face new challenges. The cabin that had been perfect for two adults felt cramped with a baby and all his necessities. The isolation that had once been a blessing became a concern when they thought about Samuel's future education and social development. He needs more than we can give him up here, Rebecca said one evening as they watched their son sleeping peacefully in his makeshift crib. School's other children opportunities. Are you saying you want to leave the mountain? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. I'm saying I want our son to have choices. If he wants to be a mountain man like his father, that should be his decision. But he should also have the option to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever else he dreams of becoming. Matt understood what she was saying, even though the thought of leaving their sanctuary filled him with anxiety. The mountain had been his refuge, his healing place, but it had never been meant to be a permanent prison. There's a valley about 10 miles south of here, he said slowly. Good farmland, close enough to town for schools, but far enough away to maintain our privacy. I've thought about it before, especially after Samuel was born. Would you be happy there, away from all this? Rebecca gestured toward the peaks, visible through their window. I'd be happy anywhere as long as I'm with you and Samuel. Matt's voice carried absolute conviction. This place served its purpose. It kept me alive when I wanted to die, and it gave us a safe place to fall in love and start our family. But maybe it's time to move forward. The decision to leave the cabin wasn't made lightly or quickly. They spent months planning, preparing, and gradually accepting that their future lay not in isolation, but in community. Matt began making trips down the mountain to look at property and assess their options, while Rebecca started teaching Samuel the basic skills he'd need in the wider world. By the spring following Samuel's birth, they had found their new home, a modest ranch house on fertile land with access to good schools and decent neighbors. The transition wasn't easy for Matt, who'd grown accustomed to solitude, but he found unexpected joy in the simple pleasures of community life. Samuel thrived in their new environment, growing into a bright, curious toddler who charmed everyone he met. He had Rebecca's intelligence and Matt's quiet strength combined with an infectious laugh that could light up any room. Neighbors who'd initially been skeptical of the mysterious couple from the mountain gradually accepted them as valued members of the community. The legal proceedings against Charles Dawson dragged on for nearly 2 years, during which time his business empire slowly collapsed and his political influence evaporated. Rebecca followed the news with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that justice was finally being served. sadness for the years of her life that had been stolen by fear. When word finally came that Charles had been sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, Rebecca felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she'd been carrying since her wedding day in Denver. She was truly free now, not just legally, but emotionally and psychologically as well. "It's over," she told Matt that evening as they sat on their porch watching Samuel play in the yard. "Really and truly over. How does it feel?" Rebecca considered the question seriously. "Like I can finally stop looking over my shoulder, like I can make plans for the future without wondering if we'll be here to see them through." That future unfolded more beautifully than either of them had dared to hope. Their ranch prospered through hard work and careful management. Samuel grew into a bright, confident young man who excelled in his studies and showed promise in whatever he attempted. Rebecca became an integral part of the community, using her education and social skills to help establish the area's first proper school and library. Matt discovered talents he'd never known he possessed, becoming known throughout the region for his skill with horses and his ability to find water on the most barren land. The isolation and grief that had once defined him were gradually replaced by purpose and contentment. On Samuel's 10th birthday, they received an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Jim Mallory, older and grayer but still carrying his badge with pride, rode up to their ranch house with news that would close the final chapter of their mountain saga. "Charles Dawson is dead," he announced without preamble after they'd exchanged greetings and settled on the porch with coffee. Rebecca felt surprisingly little at the news. How pneumonia contracted in prison, apparently he'd been sick for weeks but refused medical treatment, died alone in his cell 3 days ago. Matt studied Rebecca's face, looking for signs of the fear or anxiety that had once dominated her expression when Charles's name was mentioned. Instead, he saw only a kind of peaceful resolution. "I should feel something," she said finally. "Relief or satisfaction or even sadness, but I don't feel anything at all." "That's probably healthy," Jim observed. "Means you've moved on, built a life that doesn't depend on his existence or absence." That evening, as they put Samuel to bed and settled in for another quiet night at their ranch, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought them to this place. From that desperate knock on a cabin door during a blizzard to this peaceful evening surrounded by family and community, her life had been transformed in ways she could never have imagined. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked Matt as they prepared for sleep. "The mountain, the cabin, that simple life," sometimes he admitted, "but not enough to go back. That place was about survival. This place is about living." "And do you think we've lived well?" Matt looked around their comfortable bedroom, listening to the sounds of their established life. Samuel's steady breathing from the next room, the familiar settling of their house, the distant sounds of neighbors and community. Then he looked at Rebecca, her hair now touched with silver, but her eyes still bright with the intelligence and strength that had first drawn him to her. "Rebecca Collins, we've lived better than I ever dreamed possible." Years continued to pass in the comfortable rhythm of rural life. Samuel grew to young manhood, eventually earning a scholarship to study law at the Territorial University. He would return home regularly, bringing stories of the wider world and plans for his future, but he always carried with him the values his parents had instilled, the importance of standing up for those who couldn't protect themselves, the power of love to overcome the worst circumstances, and the understanding that true strength came from character rather than force. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Matt and Rebecca returned to the mountain cabin for a brief visit. The structure was still sound, maintained by the occasional hunter or prospector who appreciated its shelter, but it felt impossibly small and primitive compared to the life they'd built below. "I can barely believe we both lived in there," Rebecca marveled, standing in the doorway of the single room that had once contained their entire world. "It was perfect for what we needed then," Matt replied, running his hand along the stone fireplace where they'd shared so many quiet evenings. "But we outgrew it just like we were supposed to." They spent the night in their old cabin talking about the past, and planning for the future. Samuel was engaged to be married to a wonderful young woman who shared his passion for justice and reform. There would be grandchildren soon, and the legacy of love and courage they'd built together would continue into another generation. As they prepared to leave the mountain for what would probably be the last time, Rebecca stood on the porch where Charles Dawson had once threatened their happiness and looked out at the vast wilderness that had sheltered their love. "Thank you," she whispered to the peaks and valleys that had given them sanctuary when they needed it most. The mountain stood silent and eternal, keeping its secrets and continuing its patient watch over all the souls who sought refuge in its embrace. Somewhere in those peaks, the ghosts of desperate conversations and passionate declarations lingered, reminders of the power of human connection to triumph over the worst that life could offer. Matt joined Rebecca on the porch, slipping his arm around her waist in the gesture that had become second nature over their years together. "Ready to go home? I am home," she replied, exactly as she had so many years ago. But now the words carried a different meaning. Home wasn't a place, it was the life they'd built together, the family they'd created, the community they'd joined, and the love that had sustained them through every challenge. They rode down from the mountain together, two people who'd found each other in the storm and built something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate pasts. Behind them, the cabin stood empty, but not abandoned, ready to offer shelter to the next souls who might need its protection. The valley below spread out before them, green and fertile and full of life. Their ranch house waited in the distance, solid and welcoming, surrounded by the evidence of their success and happiness. This was their real sanctuary now, not a place of hiding, but a place of flourishing. As they reached the valley floor and headed toward home, Rebecca felt their story settling into its proper perspective. What had begun as a desperate flight from violence had become an epic of love, courage, and redemption. The frightened pregnant woman who'd knocked on a stranger's door in a blizzard had discovered strength she never knew she possessed. The broken hermit who'd opened that door had found reasons to live and love again. Their story had become part of the mountain's mythology, whispered around campfires and told in the towns below. Some versions emphasized the romance, others the adventure, and still others the triumph of justice over power. But at its heart, it remained a simple tale of two people who'd refused to give up on the possibility of happiness. Samuel would carry that story forward along with the values and lessons it contained. His children would grow up knowing that love was stronger than fear, that courage could overcome any obstacle, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not for glory or gain, but simply for the right to exist peacefully and love freely. And in the end, perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was everything. The sun set behind them as they rode toward their ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reflected off the windows of their home. Another day was ending, another chapter in their long and happy life together was drawing to a close. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, as tomorrow always did. But tonight, Matthew and Rebecca Collins would sleep peacefully in their own bed, surrounded by the life they'd built with their own hands and their own hearts, secure in the knowledge that their love had proven stronger than every force that had tried to destroy it. The mountain wind whispered through the pines one final time, carrying their story into legend, and the stars emerged one by one to watch over the valley, where two souls had found their sanctuary at last.